If I had to ask Oliver, who do you think the most successful Cosa Nostra mafia boss in the United States was of all times? Who do you think it was? I don't think it was, John Gotti. I don't think it was Al Capone. Joe Colombo, Carmine Persico. They pretty tight-fisted over their families. They held it for a long time. Paul Castellano, the Chin, Fat Tony Salerno. No, I don't think it was any of those. Stay tuned. I'll tell you who it is. All right, everyone. Quick thing before we continue. You know what everyone tells me at events? They come up and they say, Michael, I bought your wine just to support you. And then they say, but I kept buying it because it's so darn good. And that's the best compliment I ever get. So enjoy it. Here it is. Let's get back to it. Who comes to mind right away? Of course, John Gotti. He was the kind of prototype guy after Al Capone. And I said maybe he copied Al Capone's style. Who knows? But he certainly was out there. He was notorious. He was a huge name. He's got a worldwide reputation. Everybody knows John Gotti. And of course, we have Paul Castellano. We have Carmine Persico, we have Joe Colombo, Tony Salerno, the Chin, all of whom I had the pleasure at one point of meeting. When I say pleasure, understand this. I'm not glorifying their positions. I'm not glorifying the mob in any way. I'm just telling you that there were some people that I enjoyed meeting and some people that I enjoyed being around, whether they be in that life or not. And, again, I'll say I had the pleasure of meeting them because they were in that life. They were special people. They reached a certain level, and to reach that level in that life is not always easy. So, but if I had to name the most successful, smartest mob boss of all times, at least here in the United States, would be an easy pick, and it would boil down to one guy,
Looking for an easier way to get that LLC next to your business name? Say hello to Taylor Brands. Just go
and that's Carlo Gambino. And Carlo Gambino was the antithesis of both John Gotti and Al Capone, in that he really understood what omerta was all about. Omerta, the oath that we took, was an oath of silence. You're not supposed to even mention Cosa Nostra or Mafia. You never admit that exists. You never talk about it. That's what omerta really is. And he was the epitome of a mob boss who kept that oath. They never caught him on tape, as far as I know. He had nothing like that. And Understand this. He was in power from, I believe, 1957 until he passed away in 1976, almost 20 years. I don't think there was any mob boss in history that was able to rule successfully for that long. And during that time, he maintained a very low profile. He didn't want people to know who he was. He didn't live in an ostentatious way. He didn't dress to the nines like both Capone and Gotti. And I keep mentioning Gotti because he's the most obviously well known. He just knew what this life was all about. It had to be a secret life if he was going to survive. Now, let me say this. If it was a different time that he was in, let's say the mid 80s, or even a little bit earlier than that, when the government really started to produce high tech technology, surveillance techniques, and when the RICO statute came into effect in the mid 80s, and the Bail Reform Act and the Sentencing Reform Act, if all of those things were around during Gambino's time, I don't know that he would have survived like he did because all the mob bosses went down. And it was very, very difficult under those situations. A lot of guys became informants because they got caught on tape and a lot of stuff was happening. They were facing a lot of time. And you know the story there. We went through that and other sites have gone through that. So you get it. But during his time, he was able to really rule with an iron fist. He was called Capo Tutti di Capo, meaning the boss of all bosses. I think he was the most respected boss of his era for sure. And so, he's a very interesting guy. Just to go back a little bit. And by the way, I did have the pleasure of meeting him. I was very young. He lived out in Long Island where my dad was. Before my dad got in all his trouble, he visited him at one point in his home in Massapequa, and I happened to be with him. Only met him for a few minutes. He was a gentleman. He was a bit older at that time, probably in his probably late 60s. And I said hello to him. I didn't realize, his authority or who he was, or that he was the boss, or my dad didn't explain anything to me. I just met him and a few other people at that point in time. That was the only time I met him. It wasn't an official meeting, and I certainly wasn't in the life at that time. But again, my impression, nice old man at that point in time. But, to give you a little bit of his history, oftentimes Vito Corleone in The Godfather, who's kind of a composite of a different, of a few mob guys, I would say. He had some similarities with Carlo Gambino. What were those similarities? Well, if you saw the way Vito conducted himself, he was very low key. Very rarely did he raise his voice. He didn't get too excited. He tried to really live up to the oath that he took. In Godfather 2, the way he conducted himself, kind of the same way. And he was kind of, I think, patterned mainly his character after Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino, like Vito Corleone, came over here on his own. Yes, he came from Italy, from Sicily. He was Sicilian, like Vito Corleone, and he came to the United States on his own. And when he first came here, I think he went to North Carolina or South Carolina, where his cousins, the Castellanos, were living. I think he stayed with them for a while, and then he went up to New York when they went up to New York, and that's how his kind of life started in New York. When he first got here, young guy, he must have established himself on the streets pretty quickly. Yeah, they say that he committed murders, although they don't give us any murders. You know, they always say he was a murderer, but they don't tell us about any of the murders specifically that he committed. He did connect with Lucky Luciano and Costello. And by the way, Costello was kind of the same character as Gambino. So I'm wondering if Gambino kind of patterned his style like Costello's. Costello was very low key. Even though he was in a lot of political connections, he understood that life. He was, again, another guy that I think was one of the smartest guys in that life. So Gambino connects with them, and they joined a gang called the Young Turks, and it was Luciano and Costello, Gambino. Meyer Lansky was around at the time, Bugsy Siegel. And what happened at that time in New York, they kind of came up against the old timers, the Mustache Pete's, the Mazzaria, the Maranzano. You know, these were the old time guys, and they didn't kind of, like the younger guys. They resented them in a way. They had their own way of doing things. And the younger guys like Luciano, Costello, Gambino, they did things kind of differently. Well, it led to a war, the Castello Moresi War. And it was actually the younger guys fighting the Mustache Pete's and those crews. And it lasted for quite a while. Luciano realized, Costello the same thing. You know what? We're not going to accomplish anything going to war. We got to try to settle this thing and try to resolve this thing. So they sat down with some of the older guys and they did resolve things at that point, but they had another plan in mind. And that plan was they were going to get rid of both Mazzaria and Maranzano and they were going to take over. And eventually that's what they did. They put a hit out on both of them successfully, knocked them both off. And then it was Luciano who was in control with Costello. And you understand what happened at that point. That's when Lucky said, hey, we got to be organized. We have to have an organization here. And he organized the families into what we know Cosa Nostra to be today. He created the commission. Again, Pino was with them all the time. He was a very loyal soldier at that time. Then it came a point where I believe Vito Genovese, who was also an active member at that time, he kind of got out of hand. I'm not going to get into the whole detail. It's another story. Anyway, he had to go. And what happened at that point? He became the head of the family in 1957. And, to give you a little bit more about his character, there is a soldier in the Colombo family named Dominic Sciallo. They called him Mimi. I knew Dominic well in my younger years because he was at one point a soldier under my father. Came to my house all the time. And, I also knew him as Uncle Dom, but sometimes they called him Mimi, but I knew him as Uncle Dom. And there was an incident at Gargiulo's restaurant in Brooklyn when Mimi actually insulted Carlo Gambino in front of people, insulted him. You don't insult a mob boss ever, and you certainly don't insult them in front of people. But what did Carlo do? Nothing. He kind of smiled. He just didn't retaliate in any way, didn't say a word, nothing. But what did he do? You don't get away with, making fun of or being disrespectful to a boss, whether it be in public or private. So he had him killed. And who killed him? As far as I know, it was Charlie Moose Panarella. Now, Charlie was a captain in our family. I knew Charlie very, very well. One thing about Charlie Moose, he was known to be, he was like a Roy DeMeo type in that way. And I think you know what that means. His reputation was to be a killer. Now, I didn't know him that way, obviously. We were in the same crew, same family, so I knew him. I liked him. One thing that that I always remember about him, his hair was always perfectly manicured, no matter what. Always had his hair right. But he was a little gruff. A lot of guys I remember, soldiers, did not like being in his crew. But anyway, he was given the contract. My father was away at the time. This was sometime in the mid 70s, and he carried it out to a T. I think they found Mimi in cement block, encased in cement somewhere. Anyway, so you don't get away with, like I said, abusing a boss in any way, shape, or form. And that's what happened to Mimi. But Carlo, as you know, he went on to, grow one of the biggest families, if not the biggest. The Gambinos and the Genovese, bigger than the other three. Ran it successfully for 19 years, made a tremendous amount of money, was very low key. There was one point in time where they actually had a government van and they advertised that it was a government van parked outside of his house. And they were surveilling him. They were watching people going in and out. They had electronic surveillance on him. They never got anything on him the whole time that the van was there. It's kind of remarkable to me that back then, at that time, before they had all this high-tech surveillance equipment, when the government was surveilling you, they wanted you to know about it. My dad was under surveillance. He had 6 or 7 different agencies parked around our house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They didn't make any bones about it. They were there. They wanted you to know they were there. They followed us. And it's kind of ironic to have an FBI van right outside the house monitoring everything. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to do anything to get in trouble? It was so bad for my dad that, in order to shake them when he had a meeting that he had to go to, we owned houses, or he did, in Brooklyn. My whole family lived in there. Remember, my dad was one of 19 kids. So there was a lot of houses in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And some of them, the way they were located, the back of one house, the front faced one street, the back of the house faced the back of another house where the frontage was on another street. So my dad would park outside of one house, go in the house, go out the backyard, jump over the fence, go through the back of the other house, out the front where somebody was waiting to drive him. Sometimes, somebody else that I knew, and that's how he would get away from surveillance for a while. You had to be very creative back then. But it was amazing how they just stood out there and they said, "Hey, we're listening to you. Make a mistake." It was kind of silly, really. Anyway, Gambino managed to, I don't even know if he probably had a couple of arrests, but he never did any prison time. I think he had one conviction, maybe for a tax case or something like that. Never did any real time at all. He was the one guy that really managed to outsmart the government, and a guy that was under heavy surveillance, heavy scrutiny. Again, if it was in RICO times, I don't know that he would have been able to do that. There was too many other weapons and tools that the government had. Too many guys were going informants. So I don't think he'd been able to do that. But you got to give him credit because Luciano wasn't able to do it. Vito Genovese went to jail. All the big guys went to jail. You know the story. The only one that escaped was Meyer Lansky. Another very low key guy. That's the secret in that life. Don't let anybody know who you are. Stay as low key as you possibly can. But so many guys made the mistake. I made that mistake. I'll be honest with you. Look, I was making good money and, I bought myself nice things. I lived a good life. I became a target of law enforcement. I was constantly in the media also. It was a mistake. It led to my downfall in a way at that time. So you just can't do that. When you're committing criminal activity, you got to fly under the radar. Unless today, like out in LA, if you want to go steal something out of a store, you can do it in front of anybody. Just make it under $900 and then you can walk in, steal, and go out. These are crazy times. Trust me, I don't get it at all. But if you're going to be in a mob, in a gang, you got to be low key. And let me say this, I'm talking about the life and I'm talking about a guy and I'm talking that he was successful in that life. But as always, I discourage everybody from being involved in a criminal lifestyle. You're not going to make it in today's day and age. No way, no how, impossible. I've been speaking to young people and gangbangers for the last 20 years. I tell them the mob life, the street life, they're evil lifestyles. And people today, you got to do the right thing. You have to do it as best you can because, consequences are too severe for actions. When you're mob related, gang related, criminal activity, it's no good. And whatever's happening now with this defund the police and this soft on crime, it's going to reverse itself because people are not going to stand for it. The streets are not safe anymore. And you know what? There is a public outcry that's building now, and it's going to continue to build because the number one responsibility of our government on a federal and state level is to keep its citizens safe. That's it, to keep them safe. And when you're failing in that regard, you're failing in everything. So there is an outcry now. There is a revolt happening, even in democratic cities. Sorry, I have to say it because it's the blue states that are suffering the most with the soft on crime nonsense. It's going to change because people have had enough. So, again, Carlo Gambino, boss of all bosses, the most successful crime boss, I think, in history, at least in Cosa Nostra, at least in Mafia. He died in 1976. He's buried in St. John's Cemetery. My dad is buried in there. I think Lucky Luciano is buried there. Another thing about Carlo, when Luciano died, that was his good friend. He outwardly went to the funeral and he actually, he spoke on Luciano's behalf at that point in time. So, when he had to come out, he came out, and I respect that about him. He didn't hide it. He was just a special guy in that regard. And again, the most successful mob boss of all time, Carlo Gambino.